be fantastic.
Beauty.
Oh
Looking
yeah,
forward to it.
awesome. I got the chat up. It looks like we already have some people waiting for us, and it's about to switch over. Well,
Amazing.
hello, welcome everybody. Hi there. We are here with my esteemed guest, DM Steve. Say hello.
Oh, hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is wild. I'm so excited to be here, and I love that you call me your esteemed guest. When I'm just I reached out to you to fanboy a little bit about your content. So this is really bizarre of me.
Yeah, it's always kind of weird, bumping into people in the space, because I was a fan of your stuff. I had no idea that you even knew who I was.
That's so funny. I love that.
Oh man. So yeah, I can just go ahead and say that I first got introduced to you from your work with Daniel Kwan, right? You did a really deep dive into Oriental Adventures. So you want to go ahead and say a little bit about that for folks who might not know?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey everyone, as you can see, my name's Steve, DM Steve on Twitter and what have you. My actual name is Steve Wen, and I'm a Vietnamese Canadian. Very recently, about 2 years ago, 2 years ago, what is time? I started working with Daniel H. Kwan, who actually is one of the hosts of Asians Represent, which is a podcast and streaming platform. And he reached out to me, having already known me and talked about some of this stuff, and was like, do you want to read Oriental Adventures with me on stream, and we'll critically dissect it? And I said, no, why would I ever want to do that? But also, I would love an opportunity to work with you. So let's do it. And that snowballed. That was a pretty big thing. And we definitely, if you go back and watch them, you'll see we do a lot of learnings kind of on screen, ways that it's deconstructing something live is way different than it is deconstructing when you have time and space and you can consult with people. But doing it live, you really have to consider a lot other factors that you normally wouldn't have, especially considering who your audience might be, both live and on the VOD or what have you. In either case, I think that was kind of my really cutting my teeth on this work of diversity and equity that Asians Represent really stands for, especially given the Asian lens. So that was really exciting. Oriental Adventures was a great foray into it because it was both very easy to be like, that's racist, but also very difficult to say, why is it racist? Or why do I read this passage and feel like a knot in my stomach? Where is that coming from? Is that internalized racism? Is that coming from something recent that happened in media? Is it how I perceive myself? And it gave me a lot of jumping off points and places to really dissect that. And I'm very proud of that work and happy to be continuing it, such as tonight on the stream.
Yeah. One thing that I really got from watching it, I think I watched maybe 3 of the 5 parts or something like that, was just the rawness. Like you said, doing it right off the cuff, being exposed to everything and not having the time to digest it. You really sort of get the feelings that, how do I want to say this? I feel like you get a more honest reaction because you don't really have the time to sort of sit and think about the entire process you went behind it. Your first reactions are in some ways the most telling about your place in relation to that media.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about how we even want to perceive that, because every single time I react to it, obviously the camera is on. So that's going to affect me. If I read Oriental Adventures with some friends around a table with some pizza and wings or something like that, my reaction is probably going to be a little bit different. But, we had to have a lot of conversations around, we will have visceral reactions. We will be emotional. But which emotions do we want to highlight individually as presenters? And I made my decision pretty early on. Daniel did too. And I think as time goes on, you'll actually see that presentation shifts ever so slightly, especially towards we get to the end of it.
All right. So I guess the main topic we're going to be talking about tonight is how to do that sort of thing. How to Oriental Adventures is a really classic example we put out there in your stream of othering, of Orientalism, of sort of a colonialist mindset, all sorts of really negative things, like viewing this whole half of the world as something alien.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously there's a whole bunch of grossness, and I don't really want to dwell on that tonight. I sort of want to have a more positive tone. And right before we got on the stream, I guess I sort of laid out my basic thesis to you, is that DMs who want to create more diverse, more inclusive worlds, they have to include people who are not like themselves. If every single character in my world had to be just like me, they'd all be filled with straight white men. And that's the opposite of diversity. So we have to go ahead and include people who are not like yourself, right? Obviously, you have to include women. You have to include people of color. You have to include things that aren't just your own experience. And so I really want to explore like ways to do that sensitively, and ways that you can sort of ignore or maybe avoid some stereotypes and pitfalls.
I love that you laid it out that way, because I think you and many other of your viewers probably have this view of like, we absolutely need more equity and diversity within their games, and like that's kind of like the banner a lot of people kind of like stand under. But sometimes I like to actually just hit the pause button, just slam that down and say, hey, why do you even care? Like why do you care? And in fact, let me ask that to you directly. Why is diversity and equity so important to you?
Okay. So there's a couple of different ways we can look at this, right?
Sure.
We can do like a strictly, selfish point of view, right? Mm-hmm. That if we do not actively include diversity and inclusion in our mindset, right? If we don't have this thing that we have to look at things other than ourselves, then we fall into this habit of defaulting to what we know. And when you default to what you know, you end up with a really boring style games, really boring sort of narratives, because it's familiar and comfortable. And that's no fun. So from a strictly selfish point of view, we can argue that. Okay. But I think the better and more honest point of view is that we want to build a community that's more inclusive of everybody. We live in a society with lots of different people. This is something that everyone can enjoy. There's nothing special about RPGs that's exclusive to white men. And so when I live in Columbus, Ohio, right? And then and Columbus is a pretty diverse city. It's a little microcosm of America. We have a whole bunch of populations. But when you go to Origins, and despite everything, it's just filled with white folks, right? And that makes me sad, because I know that there are all sorts of people in my community who could enjoy this hobby as much as I do. But we have to create this space that makes them feel welcome and accepted, makes them feel comfortable and welcome and accepted.
That's awesome to hear. Thank you for sharing that. I love hearing that. And I love that you kind of had like two sides of it. Obviously, there's a spectrum of reasons why you might care about this. The selfish reason, I think, is a really good way to appeal to a lot of people in their, sense of rationality and logistics, right? And that's totally a valid way of doing it. It's like D&D is a business. It's a hobby. It's like movies and other genres.
Maybe even selfish is sort of like a mean way of putting that. Like you can say pragmatic. Like there are real tangible benefits other than it's the ethical, moral arguments.
Exactly. And then you touched on kind of the more like social justice reasons. It's kind of like we do recognize that there's racial inequality and like a lot of nuanced stuff that we probably won't have time to get into, but that exists today. So how can we make sure that, the hobby that we love is accessible to all these people, considering the origins, the other context of it? And I think this is like a really great way of putting it. One thing I would like to comment on, though, is you mentioned Ohio is a very white state. And true statement. But even talking about whiteness, I think is also something that people need to deconstruct. What I mean by that is, whiteness usually refers to skin color, but whiteness as an ideology has a lot more going on there that people tend to shy away from, because it's actually quite dangerous to talk about it, to be honest. But whiteness itself, there's a lot to unpack there. The idea is that whiteness is a mutable thing. This is how white supremacy works. White supremacy works by using whiteness as a moving target. Being white is a definition in a time and space. And at any point in time, your whiteness can be taken away from you. There are conditions to it. And that can be very, very harmful and very surprising and downright dangerous. We see this a lot in history, where people's whiteness is basically revoked by hate groups. So when it comes to people trying to represent and moving away from their whiteness, obviously, yes, do that. But also, if you have the time and the space and the resources, definitely, to deconstruct what whiteness means to you, I think it's worthwhile. Let me give you an example. Most white people I talk to, they have ethnicities and origins and ancestries that, although their skin is white, are people that come from trauma and oppression. So if you're Eastern European, tell me those stories. Absolutely. And those Eastern European stories, I wouldn't consider those white outside of just sharing a skin color, because they do not fit in with the framework of white supremacy. So when you want to tell stories about the Baba Yaga, and that's like part of your ancestry, that does not promote white stories. That promotes Eastern European stories, whatever label you want to give it. And when you give it that label and you talk about it from that lens, not only are you pushing away white supremacy, you're actually causing a decoupling of white supremacy and your own histories, which will pay back in dividends, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, but I would definitely agree that we can spend a whole lot of time like deconstructing whiteness as sort of like a global concept, and that's a really key point in recognizing that sort of a dangerous part of white supremacy is that can be this whiteness as a personal attribute can be taken away by other factions, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I get what you're saying. I'm not really yeah.
There's I love that you have like this. I can see it in your eyes. I can see it. You have like this sudden discomfort. And I like that because that discomfort is kind of like you're at a crossroads. Like you can either lean into the discomfort and maybe turn into a learning opportunity, or you could lean away from it and go to somewhere that's more comfortable. Those are your really only two options. And both are valid, 100%. You know, it's a very privileged thing for someone like me to say, lean into your discomfort to learn something new about yourself and your family's history. And not everyone has that opportunity. Like I had mentioned before, sometimes like kind of off screen, sometimes we just kind of sit into a survival mode, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Well, I think I think in general, if we're going to talk about whiteness sort of as a global context, right? It is definitely helpful to sort of deconstruct that, right? To sort of break it away, because I think a more healthy appreciation for like, you know, white people in general would be to have sort of pride in like an individual heritage, right? Because whiteness is sort of like you said, it's a construct, right? Like you can be proud to be, you know, French or Italian or, you know, Appalachian. What makes you, you know, your individual piece of this earth story special. And, you know, that's a really useful lens to sort of help you understand and appreciate what other people find special about their own cultures. So I think I think that might be a healthy way to approach that.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, wow. So we went on a little rabbit hole there.
Yeah, I will also recognize that these conversations, like the brain chemistry, can only handle so much like jarring at once before like you before it like kind of breaks down, has to go back to what it's used to. So, you know, happy to like take a deep breath. We can segue into something else that's a little bit more like kind of to plan or within the comfort area here.
Yeah. So let's revert back into that. So now that we have some ideas, I think we can maybe talk about how whiteness could manifest in tabletop RPGs, right? And I think a lot of that is sort of your generic fantasy assumptions, right? That when you're go ahead and playing games, that sort of the default setting is loaded with, you know, white culture, right? You know, knights in shining armor, brick castles that are constructed a certain way,
Sure.
things like that. But so if we're going to try to create a more inclusive space, how would you maybe challenge some of those assumptions?
Yeah, I think the most important part to me is we already talked about the why. Like, why are you even doing this? Because you could absolutely just like have your entire D&D campaign happen in France, and like that's totally valid. Like, I would never tell someone like, oh, you know, you didn't talk about any of the Chinese cultures in your French campaign. Like that doesn't really meld for me. But if you're looking to better represent other peoples and whatnot, and you've already gone through the why, and you have like this pessimistic or this like social justice lens on it, then James Mendez Hodes has a great article called "May I Play a Character from Another Race," which I think is a great piece to start off with, because he kind of breaks it down to layers. With the first layer being just put brown and black people in your game. Just start there. Don't even like say anything about their culture. Just have their representation be there, and just like let that be for a little bit. Let that gestate, let that exist in your world. And then later on, do like a retrospective on it. Figure out what that did, if anything at all. Obviously, we would hope that it doesn't change anything, because skin color shouldn't change anything. What if it did? You know, why did it change things? You know, what stories ended up being told? Was there a difference between this and the other stories you've told in the past? And again, that can be really difficult to do.
Yeah. So can we just like pause right there? Because I think even right there, there's a little bit something more we can explore. when you say just put people of different skin tones in your game, that's already saying a whole lot. Is skin tone in that setting, things like, skin tone, eye shape, cheekbone structure, are those just accidentals of genetics? Are those as scattered throughout your population, like things like freckles or, dimples in your chin? Or are they tied to geographic locations? So are we doing like a old school, only Black people come from this part of the fantasy world? Or are we doing like Witcher style where people are everywhere?
Yeah.
Like, what would you recommend? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh God, honestly, I don't fucking know. Sorry, I don't really know. Okay, so the reason I have this visceral reaction is because we come down to like the next layer of here, and it's like, what stories are you actually trying to tell? So if you want to tell stories about, different geographical cultures, because geography is obviously a big factor in culture and how it spreads and how people share it and whatnot. If you really want to focus in on geography and how that affects peoples, then that makes total sense. I'd be like, yeah, so you have like these deserts and these mountains, and that's causing all the separation. And now people are changing their culture, and they're sharing their culture, but they can only do it in certain ways. I'm super into that.
Okay.
But if you're doing it because it's kind of like the default mindset where it's like Asian people come from Asian countries and Black people come from Black countries, I would encourage you to pause there, because like, what is that giving your story? Or perhaps more importantly, what story is you telling without actually putting intention behind it? Oftentimes, what this faux geographical separation is doing is it's saying that within these people, there's something geographically, or if geography doesn't matter in this specific case, genetically, predisposed for them. And that can be very, very harmful, because now you've begun to scratch the surface of some very harmful, bigoted language, which obviously we want to try to avoid, because it permeates a lot of our lives and it does a lot of real harm to real people.
All right. I think this is a sort of a great sort of a segue into our next little bit right here, is talking about how when you're doing this world building and you want to include people that are different, like how can you, or different cultures or different or bits of different heritages, how can you do that in a way that avoids appropriation, avoids colonialism, or avoids some of these more harmful aspects?
Yeah.
Like maybe you can walk the difference between what is homage and what is a stereotype, what is typical in an archetype, and what is, sort of a harmful cardboard cutout.
I love this question because I think it's the wrong question.
Oh, and go ahead. Enlighten me.
So I don't like this question, because I feel like what our brains want to do, like humans want to do, is draw a line in the sand. These things are A and these things are B. This is cultural appropriation. This is not. But the fact of the matter is, like many things in our life that are beautiful and scary, it has nuance to it. So what I try to recommend, and this is echoing a little bit of James Mendez Hodes's words, is that let's reframe the question of cultural appropriation. Let's go through some other motions. So the first one that I think is very accessible and easier to talk about, or easier to visualize, I'll say, is power dynamics. So you can absolutely take some cultural signifiers from other cultures and put them in your game. But let's talk about power. In your game, when you have these cultural signifiers, who has power, who doesn't have power, and how does power shift in your stories? Because truly, those are the impacts that matter the most in our real world lives. So whatever stories you are telling with regards to power dynamics are kind of the stories that you're telling your players you care the most about. So do I think it's cultural appropriation if you put a Vietnamese Ao Dai and like people just kind of wear this dress in your world? Like, I don't know. It depends. But if everyone who wears an Ao Dai in your campaign is a sex worker, well, now I have questions. I have questions about why you've chosen this and where this kind of goes, and what stories are we as a group going to tell each other? Because, I might not be comfortable with the direction we're going.
Okay, so I really like how you took the time to say, it's not black and white, right? There's a lot of nuance. And so in that case, it looks like context is really, really important. So like you said, if you say everyone who is wearing I'm sorry, what that the Vietnamese
Yeah, so the Vietnamese dress is called an áo dài.
and
My
Ao Dai.
pronunciation is wrong because I am Vietnamese Canadian and I speak this very strange dialect of Vietnamese, which is to say I don't speak Vietnamese at all. But you could replace that with really any cultural signifier, right? I apologize. I didn't ask what your personal heritage is, but I'm sure you have fashion and clothing that actually is a signifier of those cultures.
Mm-hmm. And so I always feel like kind of a corner getting this because, talking about negative stereotypes about white people is usually like done from a place of privilege.
Sure.
But I think we can bring this up that I come from like a long line of coal miners, right? Like people in my
Mhm.
family have been in the West Virginia, Tennessee area for 100 years, right? And those people also, for a long part, were very poor and oppressed by outside powers, right? Outside interests. And so, but a lot of that has sort of come down that they're poor, uneducated, yada, yada, yada. So if you had every white person in your world walking around overalls and acting like they were ill-educated, I would definitely be able to take some offense at that.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's a thing right there is that when you are including these cultural elements and you tie them only to negative stereotypes, that's definitely harmful.
Yeah.
So how do you include cultural elements that without really doing that, with maybe some reflecting some positive parts of a heritage?
Gotcha. So I think it comes down to I'm going to frame this. There's many ways to frame it. I'm going to frame it in one way that I think is more accessible based on Dungeons and Dragons, and that's on colonialism. So when you have these cultural signifiers, how does colonialism play with those cultural signifiers? So as an example, if everyone who has like these Vietnamese or whatever cultural signifiers are basically the people who were taken over by another power, you're very specifically telling a story about those colonizers and those people who are being colonized. So then the question becomes, where does the power lie within this? And how does it shift, or how do you plan it to shift over the campaign and whatnot? So when you do it that way, what you've done is you've added layers of nuance to your cultural signifiers and what they might represent. There's I'll pause there and get your thoughts because I'm kind of like I'm building the track as we're going down this road.
Yeah. So I think what most strongly resonated with me there was in the Tomb of Annihilation adventure, right? That is very obviously a case of white people coming over to colonize non-white people, right?
Sure,
like that
yeah.
is the subtext is barely there. Like they're smacking you in the face with it. And what they try to do is saying, well, the colonizers are not that smart. The folks who are native to this area are really much more able to handle this area. These other folks are out of their depth. And so it's making them look kind of foolish. But at the same time, it's sort of reinforcing this negative idea that the purpose of these people of color is to exist to be colonized by this other group. Like that's their entire function in the story. And that really rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah. And I think, to dig deeper into that, it can rub a lot of people the wrong way because it kind of sets you up. They kind of point you in a direction. And the end result really is kind of like the hellscape that is our lives today. And when I say hellscape, obviously I'm being hyperbolic, but there's a lot of oppression and harm that falls out of this kind of colonization action. And I think that's what's causing that tension and that hesitation there. I think Tomb of Annihilation is a great example to talk about in depth because, you have these people, you kind of have like this white savior trope, and there's no other way really to circumvent that trope. You're kind of like locked into that storyline. So again, we talk about power dynamics. Who has power here? The players. The players have the power. But where do they come from? And whatnot. It would be different if Tomb of Annihilation said that you came from these villages, these cultures, the people that actually care the most about this tomb and all of the harm coming out of it. It's different if you come from there and, your families and whatnot, they're all like, you're the best of the best. We love you. We cherish you. We think you have to do this. And you have a duty here to your community. That's a way different story than showing up on a boat and then plunging this dungeon.
Yeah, no, you're 100% absolutely right. So that's definitely something to be mindful about. That if you're going to put in these non-Western cultures, not to put it in a way that you're playing out these tired tropes, right? But I think at the same time, right? If we want to be, like I said, this was a television, if Dungeon Mastering Run D&D game was like a television show, it's easy to say, oh, we can just hire a wider array of writers from a wider group of cultures. But when you're DMing, it's only you. So we have to find ways, if we want, to include these other cultures that aren't our own. So what are some ways that you include cultures from, besides your own Canadian Vietnamese heritage in your D&D game? Like, surely you include bits of like Africa or Native American or Mesoamerican lore.
So right now, I don't in my home games. And there's a very specific reason why. The reason is because for my particular players and the stories we're telling, the issues that we care most about, the stories we want to tell most about, actually focus more on North America LGBTQ plus issues. So although there's an intersection between race and queerness, which is absolutely worthwhile to go through, my players are all white. So I'm going to focus on the white queer experience as I kind of see it, knowing that when I kind of set up the pieces to tell stories, what I'm essentially doing as the dungeon master is gathering as much information as I can about what stories they resonate the most with so that I can begin to lean into it, build enough trust with my players, and then challenge them on them. So as a great example, one tension in my personal game here, my players are watching, I'm so sorry. One tension that we actually have here is polyamory. So what I'm looking to do here is build enough trust with my players so that they understand that I'm going to tell stories that they're comfortable with while also challenging how they view certain things. Polyamory is something that I've telegraphed many, many, many sessions ago, kind of like following my gut and whatnot. And I've noticed that it's been causing some tension. So in the next couple of sessions, it's going to come up again. And I'm going to have a one-on-one with my players and say, hey, actually some players specifically, and say, hey, here's my plan. Here's why I'm doing it. How do you feel about it? So queer culture is absolutely a culture. And I think the way I've navigated this is how I would generally navigate other cultural signifiers.
Okay, so there's something I really want to like touch on right there.
Yeah.
So you're navigating this the way that you would navigate like lots of other. You're using queerness as sort of a stand-in for any culture that's not necessarily or any sort of non-mainstream. I guess, is that the right way to say that?
We can call it like a marginalized identity.
Yeah, a marginalized culture. There we go. Using that for a stand for like any sort of marginalized culture. But for this example, but you say that you're doing it. You're presenting this white queerness as you see it. And that's sort of really interesting right there. So you are saying, okay, I am just, living in this space. I am having all this stuff that I'm being influenced by and seen in the media. And this is my honest interpretation of it. And so if people are doing that for, other things, they're doing that, like I want to run an Arabian Nights style campaign, in Fantasy Arabia, right? There's a whole like rich, mythology and storytelling tradition there. And if they come across, well, this is my honest interpretation as I've come across this media, but it comes out, sort of wrong. Like, what can people do to sort of maybe identify things or correct themselves, or what sort of guidance would you give folks?
Feeling like you're always going to get it right is a form of privilege that sets you up so that white supremacy can hook itself into your ideology. What I mean by that is that there is a structure that is easy to hack into, which is, this goes into cancel culture. So what the pattern is that someone who has a place of privilege tries to be more accepting and accessible to marginalized identities, and they get it wrong and they get called out on it. And at that point, they can either internalize that and try to grow, or you can hold onto the resentment. You can call it cancel culture, and you can then instead lean into a supremacist point of view. We see this often, especially within Hollywood. So without going in and naming names, you can probably think of examples where someone was like, they made a bad tweet, basically, right? Like they said something shitty on Twitter, and then they got canceled for it. But if you look at the receipts, what you see are a mix of people being rightfully outraged because they had really misrepresented their identity, people who were unrightfully outraged because it's not their identity and they don't know what they're talking about. And you have people saying this is cancel culture and this is what's wrong with the world, so on and so forth, like an appeal to rationality, basically. So when the question comes up, what do you do to make sure you get it right? You kind of won't get it right if it's not your identity. It's you're always going to get it wrong to someone who shares that identity, and that's kind of okay. The idea is that when that happens, you go back to the scaffolding you had built previously. Why had you even started this whole endeavor? Why did you, at that point a year ago or whatever, decide that it was worth the pain to actually go through this and fight for social justice? Or if you're the pessimist, like, why was this a good business decision? You go through those motions, and then you go back to those people who felt offended, and you listen and you thank them for their time, and you decide how to move forward.
So what I'm hearing from you is that really what you have to do is be humble, right? You have to not only accept the fact that you are a stranger and that you're going to make lots of mistakes, but to be open to having a dialogue, not just with the people who are trying to say, hey, you might want to think about this, but also with yourself about why you came to these conclusions and why you went and decided to try to incorporate these things to begin with. Like, what was your purpose in doing so?
Yeah.
Am I hearing you right?
You are. And the reason I'm kind of like, toning down a little bit here and losing a little bit of energy is because it is so painful for someone to call you out and be like, you know what, you've actually kind of fucked up pretty bad here. Here's why. And like, or they might not even give you why. And that's totally valid too. And it hurts because we all think we're good people and we all try really hard to be good people. So when someone tells you like your best intentions led you down the wrong path, it's like jarring. It's like a shock to the system. Like everything has to restart, and that costs a ton of energy. So it's never easy, but I like to take that tension, that pain, and I like to ground it in like the why. Like, why did we start down this path? Because it helps to say that you're not starting back from ground zero. You have these milestones, you have these pillars, you have these things you've planted. So when someone sets you back a little bit, you look to these things and you say, well, let me go back to this thing because it's closest, and I'll just focus even harder on this part of social justice, and I'll try again.
Yeah, and I think going off of that is maybe there's a big difference between you doing it at home for your own private game and being able to listen to feedback versus doing it as a content creator, right? When you do things a lot of the time in public, like I do, your mistakes are there for everybody to see. And it's a lot harder to maybe reflect on that because you have all these people coming at you. But it doesn't mean that's any less important to do so.
Yeah. Obviously, we can talk a lot about the big D&D 5e streamers like Critical Role, the Adventure Zone, all this kind of stuff, but we can be a little more agnostic about it. And I think you're absolutely right. And this is worth echoing, that context matters. There's a difference between running something for your home game and running something for, a wide streamed or podcast audience. You have to be a lot more mindful of what you're doing. And my biggest tension with folks like folks on Critical Role, which to their credit, they've tried to address and put a lot of work into, is that they've had this kind of moniker of we're just friends who are just it's just a friend group and we're just playing Dungeons and Dragons as we know it. And that feels very reactionary to me. It feels very, it feels like they kind of have forgotten the context here. So you're absolutely right. Context does matter a lot in these conversations.
Yeah, because and I think that also goes along with the responsibility, right? If you are just DMing for your home group and you put in a racist trope, the only people who are really going to be affected are, the 6 people around the table. I mean, maybe we can have a side conversation about that, about how these things perpetuate in society, and they can go out and spread beyond those 6 people at their table. But compared to doing that in public, right? If you have a stream with, hundreds or thousands of people watching, then you have a much bigger responsibility to not only be mindful, I think, but to be proactive in trying to avoid these things, avoid these harmful portrayals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll also mention that even like for those home groups where it's like you and like 6 other people, it's never just you and 6 other people. It's you, those 6 other people, and the 36 people that those people talk to about their games. So that is probably also worthwhile to talk about, because whatever effect you're having on that group, that is going to have another effect on another group. And it is totally valid to be like, well, they can do whatever they want and it's not my problem. Like, you can absolutely focus your own energy on your own endeavors and your own enjoyment and things like that. But if you do care about this idea of building equity across the board, maybe that's something you want to dive into. Maybe you want to think about what stories you're telling your players, and then what stories are they going to tell other people.
Yeah. Ooh. All right. Yeah, so that's right. Andrew says that stream games have an audience of whoever clicks on. And I think that's absolutely right, because you don't know who's going to be at the other side, like who you're going to be necessarily influencing. You don't choose your audience when you go public with these sorts of things.
Yes, it's a super, super good point. And maybe you don't care, which again is like, you can just not care about who your audience is and you can just stream for the pleasure of it because, it changes the energy of the tables and things like that. But we go back down to the first thing that, we had critically talked about, which is, why are we even talking about this? Like, if you don't care, then this conversation probably doesn't mean much to you. But obviously, if you're tuning in, the conversation does matter. So why does it matter? And then how does that affect you, your decisions, the stories you make, and how does that affect the people who are tuning in?
Awesome. All right, so I guess we're about to wrap up real fast, but I thought maybe we could spend a few minutes and maybe you can talk about some examples from home games, right? Like some things that you would like to see like incorporated more fully in people's home games. Like if they're going to take some elements and they want to say, you know what, I'm sick of doing, vanilla Western fantasy. I want to, and see here we're getting into trouble right here, right? Because already there's this idea of doing something other than the West is exotic.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of people running their home games, it is, because it's not what they're familiar with. So they are trying, I think they're doing a very human thing, right? They're showing positive interest in something that's not like themselves. And so they want to put that in there. They want to put something that's not of themselves in there. So what are some things that you would recommend to dive into, like to help them out along that quest? Or some things that you've done to sort of, I don't know, spice things up?
Yeah. We'll break down how you describe that later. But
no, go for it. Like, you can tell that I was having like trouble finding a good way to get across what I wanted to without sounding, again, like this colonialist white supremacist language.
Yeah, totally. And I appreciate the tension there, because like, obviously you don't want to look bad in front of me. Like, I come on here, I'm an Asian creator, and you don't want to look like a bigot. And like, that's super valid. It's like a totally human response. So yeah, you pick your words carefully. And I understand that, and I get what you're putting down, and I'll never hold it against you because we talked about this. But to answer your question, things you could do in your home games to kind of diversify how you tell your stories. I'll start with James Mendez's Hodze article again. May I play a character of another race? I would say if you are in like this just ground level and you don't have any people of color in your game, just start making people of color in your game prevalent. Just describe an NPC as black. It's not a bad word. You can just say they're black. Describe an NPC as Asian. Just call them Asian. It's cool. Heck, if you want to say that they look East Asian, Southeast Asian, Central Asian, Western Asian, by all means, do it. They're not bad words. Similarly, you can call people disabled. These aren't bad words. You can call people gay, lesbian. You can call them trans. They're not bad words, but context does matter. So my first recommendation is to just start including them. Just have them be present, because what you're doing by doing that is basically you're mimicking the pathways that we have seen throughout media. When it comes to media, representation came first, and it was usually bad representation. There were some good examples, obviously, but it's usually bad representation. But usually what happens is we ask for the best representation and the best equity we possibly can, equity we can possibly get, and we fall short of it. And we lick our wounds, we take a look at it, we decide what we liked, what we didn't like, we talk to people and we listen to their stories, and we decide how we're going to do it next. So level 1, just include people of color, include queer people. Level 2, listen to the stories that they tell, like actual stories that they tell, and then decide how those stories and yours connect. So I would never tell someone to tell a story that is completely alien to them, because you're going to fuck it up. And you're going to fuck it up real hard. And it's going to be really painful for you. And it's going to be painful for me. So don't do that. What I would like to do is I'd love to see how you take these cultural elements and how you connect them to your own. Great example, Kung Fu Panda. Kung Fu Panda is a great example because it is written by white people. It feels very Chinese, but it's not, because all the cultural signifiers are kind of wrong, but they're wrong in a very loving way. They're wrong in a way that someone who thinks they're wrong in the way that someone who consumes Chinese media, or what they think is Chinese media, would think Chinese culture is like, which in itself is an identity. What I mean by that, a lot of Kung Fu Panda feels like Chinatown, but Chinatown is not China. Chinatown is built to look like a tourist trap for obvious reasons, which Kung Fu Panda doesn't get into, and it doesn't plan to ever. But what that does for that creator is it allows to take those cultural signifiers, tie them with their own experiences and their own love and their own empathy. It allows them to tell a story that feels very human. And I think that's one of the main reasons why it's so successful. I think Accented Cinema did a great review of Kung Fu Panda and why Chinese audiences love it, despite the fact that it's not really Chinese.
Yeah, I think on the note, I just want to share another anecdote that came to mind, sort of along the similar vein. The 1001 Arabian Nights, right?
Sure.
That book of stories. It was collected by a Frenchman and then published in French, and that's how a lot of them came to the West.
Totally.
What's interesting is the most iconic, or what we would think is the most iconic stories, like Sinbad, Aladdin, Alibaba, and the 40 Thieves in the cave. None of that were in the originals. Those were not actually Arabian folk stories that he heard. He thought they sounded as though they fit the similar ilk and themes, and they had a bunch of cliches from all of those stories put together in those few ones, and those are the ones that caught on the imagination. And so now, even nowadays, people who are native Arab writers writing about that in Arabic, they still call back to those stories, which are just a Westerner's interpretation of the original ones. Absolutely. So I just think that's sort of an interesting note about how culture is sort of circular in a way. It's not a line, it's sort of a continuum.
Yeah. So I love that example, especially with Aladdin and like Sinbad and things like that. But let's focus on Aladdin because Disney is a big property.
Mm-hmm.
I had talked earlier on about talking about power dynamics. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? And how does power shift as the story goes on? Everyone's homework for tonight is to think about Aladdin and think about who had power to start that story off, who didn't have power, and then how did the power shift? Because that is very telling of what these Western creators thought about these cultures.
Oh man, yeah, that's great stuff. All right, well, Steve, thank you so much for being on. This is like I said, a very illuminating conversation. I mean, I certainly got a lot out of it. I hope our audience did too. Do you have any parting thoughts that you want to share with everyone?
I am going to share that it is Christmas in July on DriveThruRPG. So a lot of things are on sale. So if this conversation was really, really helpful for you, I recommend checking out many of the titles that are out there made by marginalized voices. So Unbreakable, volume 1 is 25% off right now. I'm actually a writer in that one. That is a book written purely by Asian writers and illustrated only by Asian artists. That was a wonderful project to work on. I wrote a adventure on based on my experience of climbing a mountain in Vietnam when I was a teenager. So that's really, really cool. You will see other stories there, such as I got the pleasure of interviewing someone, Colette, who had written a escaping me now, another Southeast Asian story about rivers and pollution, which was really, really wonderful. So that's really, really cool. You can also check out the Uncaged anthology. I did not write that one. I was not involved in that one, but those are written and illustrated by people from marginalized genders. So those are really, really cool. If you're looking for just adventure hooks or adventure one-shots written by a voice that maybe is outside of your circle of influence.
Awesome. D&D Digest is all excited that you mentioned Unbreakable. You should check them out. They are an all-Asian live play.
Absolutely. That'd be all Asian live play. Excuse me? Excuse me? Yeah, I'm into that. I'm super into
all right.
that.
Well, this stream will be up for the next 24 hours before I move it on to my $1 Patreon. And again, this is not just a monologue. This is a dialogue. So I read all these comments. I'm really interested in your thoughts. So please let me know what you think in the comments below. Bye, everyone.